I rise to speak to the proposed Public Service Amendment Bill 2023. This bill offers small steps to improve the Australian public service at a time when we have a crisis of confidence in its governance. The Australian Public Service includes all entities employing staff under the Public Service Act 1999, currently about 160,000 individuals. They administer the services which collect our tax, monitor our borders, procure and distribute our medications, administer our health systems, care for our elderly, monitors our schools and our universities, look after the disabled and the unemployed. We need them. We should respect them. We need to be able to trust them. A number of recent studies have found that APS capability is no longer fit for purpose, that it needs renewal of its fundamental structure, hierarchies and practices. To that end, a report was commissioned in 2018 by the Turnbull government to consider reform of the Australian Public Service. When presented in 2019 by David Thodey, that report noted a weakened public service resulting in weakened service delivery for Australians, and it called for service-wide transformation. It said, to achieve this aspiration, the APS will need to undergo significant transformation, guided by the recommendations in this review, uniting through a clear purpose, building its professionalism and its expertise, embracing data and digital, looking out and working with partners to solve problems, getting rid of excessive silos and hierarchy, and strengthening service-wide leadership and governance. The report made 40 key recommendations which it suggested would trigger and sustain far-reaching change when implemented. It identified strong support for change, but it also forecast the need for a deep commitment from the APS and from its leaders, with strong endorsement from the government, for that reform to succeed. Further, the report suggested that very significant financial investment was needed, $100 million to kick-start the transformation and then $1 billion a year to supply better service outcomes through digital transformation and other public capital. During the 2022 federal election campaign, the Australian Labor Party did commit to improving the APS. That commitment has led to this bill. The reform agenda is informed by the 40 recommendations of the Thodey report, but this proposed legislation directly addresses only 6 of those 40 recommendations. The government has budgeted only $72 million over 3 years to strengthen capability of the APS in October 2022, and then a further $18.5 million over 2 years in May 2023. The Thodey report called for service-wide transformational change, but this is not delivered by this bill. With this bill, the government is outlining plans and budget support for only very modest improvements to the capability of the Australian Public Service. 4 key reforms of the Thodey report are missing from the bill: measures to strengthen the power of the APS Commissioner, legislation clarifying the distinct rules of the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet as opposed to the APS Commissioner, measures to strengthen the merit-based process for secretary appointments and constrain the capacity of the Prime Minister to terminate appointments, and a measure requiring consultation of the Leader of the Opposition before appointment of the APS Commissioner. The employees and officers of the Australian Public Service are obliged to serve the government of the day with integrity. They have to provide frank and fearless advice on matters of public policy, from national security to fiscal policy to social security, across all of the machinery of government arrangements. They are a vital part of our government, and yet in a recent study, we found that only 3 out of 10 people trust their government systems. Speaker, in essence, the Thodey report identified 2 principal concerns with the Australian Public Service. Firstly, the increasing trend to outsource core public service work to contractors, and secondly, the increasing politicisation of the Australian Public Service. Last year, 1 in 4 people employed by the Australian government were external contractors. The Morrison government spent an appalling $20.8 billion on external contractors last year. Rather than incremental change, as we have with this bill, we need transformational change to our public service. Recent research confirmed that, I quote from the recent report, Citizen satisfaction with service delivery experience is directly related to their level of trust and advocacy in government. Paradoxically and quixotically, Madam Speaker, that report was undertaken by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Most people in this House and in this country know of the recent allegations regarding PwC's breaching of confidentiality agreements around government plans for multinational tax laws. 4 of every 5 Australians now want PwC banned from further government contracts. This bill will do nothing towards that end. Last week, we heard from the Australian National Audit Office of the subversion of the Morrison government's Community Health and Hospitals Grant program. It reported that the public servants of the Department of Health acted unethically and unlawfully in that they consciously and deliberately decided not to develop opportunity guidelines for government grants. Further, despite the absence of legislation that could reasonably be relied on to authorise expenditure on some grant proposals, the public service intended to, and did, then execute grants despite the absence of a legislative authority to do so. This bill will do nothing to address the public service deficiencies identified in that report. Finally, and most egregiously, we've recently heard of the failures of robo-debt, an unlawful method of automated debt assessment and recovery employed by Services Australia as part of its Centrelink payment compliance program. Robo-debt was a case study in bad government and public service failure. We have to learn from the lessons of robo-debt, but this bill will do nothing to facilitate that. It's premature that we're seeing this limited and uninspired legislation before we see the report of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. And so I support my colleague, the member for Curtin, in her suggestion that we should delay this legislation until we have that report. The Grattan Institute reported last year that 1 in 5 federal board positions are handed to politically connected individuals. That includes 22% of the 320 members of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. For many years, we have seen successive governments hand out powerful, well-paid positions to friends, supporters and party loyalists. Instead, to the victors has gone the spoils. At a state level, this has reached new heights when John Barilaro invented his own cushy job, a new nadir or peak, depending on how you see it, of creative corruption. I wholeheartedly support my colleague, the member for Mackellar, with her separate private members bill regarding the importance of independent, non-partisan scrutiny of senior public service appointments. Again, this bill does nothing to address that issue. Speaker, in 2019, Prime Minister Morrison told this country that ministers determine policy for public servants to deliver. He discounted, he did not value, the frank and fearless advice, the competence and integrity which a well-staffed, well-funded and independent public service can and should provide. We shouldn't be debating this legislation today. We should be debating a much bigger and much more imaginative piece of legislation with the ability to guarantee for us real change, real independence for our public service, so that we can rebuild trust in our systems and in our government. It's a great shame that this bill will not do that.